Antisthenes, Part 1. The Ragged Philosopher. Let me tell you a story, not the sort with dragons and damsels, but with sandals, dust, and a man who thought most people were utterly mad. His name was Antisthenes, and I'd wager a plate of olives that you've never heard of him. Or if you have, it was likely in passing, wedged between loftier names like Plato and Aristotle, as though he were a footnote in someone else's biography. But don't be fooled. Antisthenes was no one's sidekick. He was an original, a philosophical punk, a man who thought life should be lived plainly, honestly, and without the endless fuss we humans seem to adore. He lived in Athens in the 5th century BCE, a time when ideas weren't just exchanged in books or podcasts, but bellowed from street corners, debated over wine, and carved into marble. Athens, then, was a buzzing, brilliant mess, part university, part theatre, part soap opera. Philosophers wandered about like intellectual bees, pollinating young minds, dropping ideas wherever they went. Now, Antisthenes was not born into the grand Athenian elite, which perhaps helps explain his attitude. His father was Athenian, but his mother was Thracian, a foreigner, and not from a part of the world the Greeks particularly admired. Thrace, to the ancient Greek mind, was a bit like how the British once thought of the continent, full of peculiar people with odd accents, suspect morals, and a tendency to drink too much. The result of this mixed heritage was that Antisthenes, though technically a citizen, was never fully embraced by polite society, and that suited him just fine. He didn't want to be embraced by it. He wanted to grab it by the shoulders and shake it until all the nonsense fell out. From a young age, Antisthenes had a sharp mind, and like many bright young things in Athens, he eventually found his way to the greatest philosopher of them all, Socrates. Now, Socrates was not your average teacher. He didn't have a classroom, he didn't write things down, and he didn't particularly care whether you liked him. What he did have was a gift for asking awkward questions, the kind that unravel your assumptions like a poorly tied sandal. Antisthenes adored him. He wasn't like Plato, swooning over the transcendental world of perfect forms, nor was he, like Xenophon, obsessed with Socrates' military gallantry. No, Antisthenes saw in Socrates a rare and radical thing, a man who lived according to what he preached. No frills, no pomp, just a relentless commitment to virtue, to truth, and to simplicity. And so Antisthenes, inspired by his master, decided to devote his life to this ideal. But whereas Plato went off to found the academy and build a system of philosophy so intricate it makes IKEA instructions look like haiku, Antisthenes went in the opposite direction. He tore down rather than built up. He stripped life bare, looked at what remained, and said, "Yes, this is enough." He was, in every sense, a minimalist, but not the chic, Instagram-friendly sort with white walls and tasteful potted plants. His minimalism was of the rough, sandal-wearing, sleeping-on-the-ground variety. He wore the same threadbare cloak every day, regardless of weather or occasion. He carried a staff and a bag and little else. He refused to indulge in luxury, in comfort, even in basic pleasure. He once claimed that he would rather be mad than experience pleasure. A statement so bafflingly stark, you wonder whether he was being deeply profound or simply hangry. To Antisthenes, pleasure was a trap, a seductive but dangerous illusion that distracted people from what really mattered: virtue. Now this word, virtue, Greek arete, gets tossed about rather freely in philosophy, but for Antisthenes, it had a very specific flavor. It wasn't about obeying rules or achieving moral perfection. It was about self-sufficiency, integrity, honesty, and above all, freedom from need. He believed that the only truly free person was the one who desired nothing. At this point, you might be picturing him as a sort of ancient killjoy. And yes, in a way, he was. But there was also something deeply joyful in his rejection of nonsense. He wasn't gloomy, he was fierce. Witty too. There's a marvelous story in which Plato, ever the system builder, defined a human as a featherless biped. So Antisthenes, never one to pass up a chance to make a point, plucked a chicken, brought it to Plato's school, and announced, "Here is Plato's man." The image of that poor, bald chicken, clucking indignantly at the feet of the finest minds of Greece, is one that delights me to no end. Antisthenes believed that philosophy was not a game or a career, it was a way of life. And so he took his teachings not to the wealthy or the powerful, but to anyone who would listen. He opened a small school at the Cynics, a gymnasium just outside the city walls, traditionally frequented by those of dubious citizenship, men like himself, with 1 foot in Athens and 1 foot outside. The name Cynics translates roughly as place of the white dog, and this is no small coincidence. From this humble mongrel institution came a new breed of philosophy, Cynicism, from kynikos, meaning dog-like. Why dogs? Because dogs, in Antisthenes' view, had it right. They lived simply, without shame, without pretense. They didn't worry about status or wealth. They didn't flatter or deceive. They were loyal, tough, and fiercely honest. The Cynic ideal was to live like a dog, in the best sense of the word, sniffing out truth, barking at falsehood, and never, ever putting on airs. Of course, not everyone appreciated this approach. Antisthenes made enemies. He annoyed people. He was mocked, dismissed, and occasionally shouted at in the street. But he didn't care. In fact, I suspect he rather enjoyed it. To be scorned by fools, after all, is something of a compliment. He lived what he taught, and for that, he won the admiration of one particularly famous pupil, Diogenes of Sinope. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another day. For now, picture Antisthenes, stooped, wiry, a wild gleam in his eye, walking through the streets of Athens, cloak fraying at the edges, staff in hand, muttering sharp truths under his breath. Not building palaces of thought, but tearing down illusions, not chasing applause, but virtue. A man who looked at all of life's glittering offerings and said, "No, thank you. I already have everything I need." Part 2. If you had wandered through Athens during the latter half of the 5th century BCE, a time when democracy was still wobbling on its baby goat legs and the Parthenon was barely out of its scaffolding, you might have encountered a rather peculiar sight. A man, lean as a reed, rough-faced and wild-eyed, wandering the agora in a threadbare cloak that seemed more like an insult to tailoring than a garment. He was not begging, he was not preaching, at least not in the sing-song sense, but he was talking, always talking. And what came out of his mouth had the sharpness of vinegar and the clarity of mountain water. That man was Antisthenes. He was, quite unmistakably, different. Now, Athens was no stranger to eccentrics. This was a city, let's remember, where men spent afternoons arguing about the essence of justice while naked in gymnasiums. But even by Athenian standards, Antisthenes stood out. He didn't dress like a philosopher, didn't decorate his speech with lofty metaphor, didn't flatter the rich. In fact, if you were rich, he likely insulted you, and if you weren't, he probably encouraged you to be proud of it. There's something gloriously unfashionable about Antisthenes. Even in a city obsessed with fashioning the mind, he had no time for pretense. Philosophy, he believed, was not a form of entertainment, nor a pursuit of cleverness. It was, in its purest form, training for the soul. Not training in the sense of lifting rhetorical weights until your arguments bulged with complexity, but training in the art of being human, honestly, fully, and with a kind of defiant grace. His central creed was that virtue is sufficient for happiness. That's it. Not money, not pleasure, not public approval, not even good luck. Virtue. One word, but a lifetime's work. Now, in Greek, the word is arete, which in some contexts can mean excellence or moral worth. But Antisthenes wasn't interested in the kind of excellence that wins you Olympic wreaths or praise from poets. He meant excellence in character, inner sturdiness, a spirit unbroken by fortune's fickle games. And here we come to one of Antisthenes' most beautiful and, dare I say, rather British qualities, his suspicion of pleasure. To modern ears, this sounds catastrophically glum. We live, after all, in an age where pleasure is practically a civic duty. One is expected to curate happiness like a Pinterest board, to pursue comfort and convenience with the zeal of a Victorian botanist chasing orchids. To suggest, as Antisthenes did, that pleasure might actually be harmful, well, it's almost heretical. But here's the trick. He didn't despise pleasure because he hated joy. He distrusted it because he believed it made people weak. He saw luxury not as a blessing, but as a soft pillow on which the soul suffocates. And if you don't believe him, try wearing an itchy jumper for 3 days. You'll either achieve enlightenment or murder someone. Antisthenes argued that the pursuit of pleasure distracts us from what matters most. Independence. If you need fine food to be happy, you are a slave to your stomach. If you need applause, you are a servant of the crowd. If you need comfort, you are at the mercy of circumstance. But if you need nothing, then you are free. There's a delightful story, perhaps apocryphal but no less telling, that Antisthenes was once asked what benefit he had gained from philosophy. His answer: the ability to talk to myself. Not madness, not solitude, self-sufficiency. He was cultivating a soul so complete, so internally furnished, that it required no validation from the outside world. The modern equivalent might be throwing your smartphone into the sea and feeling genuinely delighted by the resulting silence. His disdain for outward show extended to language itself. Antisthenes was not a man for fluff. He thought language should clarify, not obscure. He had a deep dislike for rhetorical tricks and over-polished phrases. He once said that the most valuable possession is a frank tongue. I sometimes think of him as the antidote to the politician's speech, a man who couldn't spin a euphemism to save his life and wouldn't have wanted to. He also had a curious relationship with myth and metaphor. Unlike many of his contemporaries who saw myths as useful vessels for deep philosophical truths, Antisthenes treated them with a kind of exasperated fondness, like an old uncle telling tall tales at dinner. Amusing, but not to be taken seriously. He believed that the truth was best told plainly, and that wisdom didn't need the help of Pegasus or Prometheus to fly. But what truly set him apart was his unshakable commitment to living his philosophy. Antisthenes didn't just talk about virtue, he made it his entire life. He slept on the ground. He ate simple meals. He endured mockery, hunger, and cold, all for the sake of training himself to be indifferent to misfortune. It was, in a way, a kind of asceticism, but not the gloomy, self-punishing kind. He wasn't denying himself for the sake of suffering, but for the sake of strength. And strength, for Antisthenes, was the freedom to say no. No to flattery. No to luxury. No to the constant need to be admired. He believed that the greatest power was not the power to rule others, but the power to govern oneself. And in this, he was both radical and refreshingly stubborn. He once declared, with admirable cheek, "I would rather go mad than feel pleasure." And while I personally find madness and pleasure somewhat indistinguishable in certain scenarios, my first experience with truffle oil comes to mind, one must admire the audacity. This was a man who would rather suffer with dignity than celebrate in delusion. Antisthenes might not give you comforting answers. He won't offer you 10 tips for a better morning routine or an app for guided meditations. What he will give you is a hard stare and a difficult question. What do you actually need? Strip away the gold, the acclaim, the indulgence. What remains? Is that enough? For him, it was not only enough, it was everything. Part 3. There's a particular kind of person who thrives in contradiction, who seems to bloom not in comfort or consensus, but in challenge, even provocation. Antisthenes was one such person. He wasn't just content to question the norms of his day. He relished it. He didn't push against society's boundaries. He bulldozed through them, then pitched a tent on the rubble and called it home. Today, we tend to treat philosophical disagreement with a sort of polite shrug, like two people arguing over whether a tomato is a fruit or a vegetable. It's a fruit, by the way, and anyone who disagrees should be watched closely. But in Athens, during Antisthenes' day, philosophical disagreement was more like a blood sport, albeit one conducted with words, sandals, and the occasional plucked chicken. Now, if there's one man who found himself squarely in Antisthenes' crosshairs, it was Plato. Yes, that Plato. Student of Socrates, founder of the Academy, and author of enough philosophical dialogue to fuel 1,000 university seminars and a good deal of undergraduate anxiety. For Plato, philosophy was an elegant affair. He spoke of higher realities, forms, ideal versions of everything from chairs to justice, floating in some ethereal realm that only the mind's eye could truly grasp. If reality was a messy puddle, Plato was trying to dry it with silk gloves. Antisthenes, on the other hand, wanted none of it. To him, Plato's metaphysics were like ornamental garden hedges, fussy, overdone, and utterly unnecessary. He believed that truth was to be found not in some invisible world beyond this one, but in the here and now, in what can be seen, touched, lived. He once quipped, though we use that word generously when describing Antisthenes, that "a horse I can see, but horsehood I cannot see." It's a bit like being at a dinner party with someone who, when served soup, insists on loudly questioning the concept of soup. He didn't think we needed lofty theories to live well. We needed virtue. And virtue, he insisted, was not a matter of intellect, talent, or circumstance. It was a skill, something that could be taught, practiced, refined, like playing the lyre or wrestling. But instead of perfecting chords or grappling techniques, one worked on patience, honesty, courage. These, he thought, were the true arts, and the key to mastering them? Simplicity. Simplicity for Antisthenes was not just a lifestyle choice. It was a weapon, a defense against vanity, a shield against desire, an antidote to the puffed-up nonsense of men who wore too many rings and used too many words. He lived with as little as possible. Food, shelter, clothing, bare minimums. No luxury, no indulgence, and certainly no perfumes or silken robes, which he would have regarded with the same disdain a modern minimalist might have for glitter-covered smartphone cases. There is, in all of this, something oddly modern. We tend to think of ancient philosophers as remote, sandaled sages spouting wisdom under olive trees. But Antisthenes could walk straight into a 21st century conversation, about consumer culture and make his point just as sharply. The problem with luxury, he would say, is not that it exists, but that we come to need it. Once you acquire a taste for silk, rough wool feels like punishment. Once you expect constant praise, silence feels like condemnation. Antisthenes wanted to reverse that. He trained himself to want less, so he could be more free, more whole, more impervious to the winds of fortune. His commitment to this ideal was not theoretical, it was physical. He practiced endurance like an athlete. Hunger, cold, rejection. These were not misfortunes to be avoided, but exercises in resilience. He once walked barefoot through snow, not to make a point, though knowing him that might have been a bonus, but to train his body not to depend on comfort. It was all part of a larger ambition, to be unshakable. Now to some, this might sound extreme, even pathological. One imagines Athenian mothers warning their children, "If you don't behave, I'll send you to Antisthenes, and he'll make you sleep on rocks." But to Antisthenes, this was freedom, real freedom, not the kind granted by the state, not the kind measured by wealth, but the kind earned by stripping life down to its essentials and discovering that yes, you can still stand, and perhaps stand taller than before. Let us not forget, too, that all of this was happening in a city obsessed with appearances. Athens was glamorous, wealthy, and a bit too pleased with itself. The elite spent fortunes on banquets, perfumes, and gold-threaded tunics. Public life was a performance, and many philosophers, ironically, were part of that theatre, elegantly bearded, hands clasped, discoursing in poetry. Antisthenes walked into this gilded scene like a feral dog at a tea party. He didn't want to dazzle people, he wanted to wake them up. Sometimes, quite literally, he would approach strangers and challenge them. "What do you think happiness is? Why do you dress like that? Who are you trying to impress?" One can almost hear the uncomfortable chuckles, the muttered apologies as people hurried away, and yet one suspects that many, deep down, felt the sting of truth in his barbs, because his questions weren't designed to shame, they were meant to liberate, to shake people from the trance of habit, of status, of inherited assumptions. He believed that most people were asleep, dreaming that wealth, pleasure, and honor were ends in themselves. Antisthenes wanted them to wake up. He didn't care if they thanked him. In fact, he rather expected they wouldn't. One of the most revealing moments in his life is said to be when someone asked him what he considered most important in life. His answer? To conquer pain and not be conquered by pleasure. A sentiment that might be rejected by self-help gurus and travel influencers, but which carries with it a kind of deep, flinty dignity. He wanted to be the kind of person who could face anything and smile, perhaps even chuckle, through the worst of it. We sometimes imagine ancient wisdom as soft and gentle. Antisthenes offers us something sterner, more muscular. Not the balm, but the brace. Not the lullaby, but the slap. And yet, there is something tender beneath his hardness. A belief, perhaps, that we are stronger than we think. That happiness does not lie in what we add to our lives, but in what we are brave enough to subtract. That if we strip away illusion, habit, vanity, we might uncover something quiet and solid beneath. A self that needs little, fears less, and walks through the world not begging for approval, but simply being. It's not an easy way, but it might just be the truest. Part 4. If one had to pick a single phrase to describe Antisthenes, a strong candidate would be difficult man. Difficult in that he challenged everything, questioned everyone, and seemed allergic to anything even remotely resembling convention. but also difficult in that he lived in such a way that even the most indulgent citizen of Athens had to pause and wonder, what if he's right? One could not accuse him of inconsistency. There was no gap between his words and his deeds, no cozy compromise between his beliefs and his behavior. Where many philosophers of the day were content to speak of truth while dining comfortably, Antisthenes preferred his truths with a side of dry bread and calloused feet. He regarded hypocrisy as a far greater sin than ignorance. After all, the ignorant can learn, but the hypocrite already claims to know. And so, with a mind as sharp as obsidian and a wardrobe that appeared to have been fashioned from discarded sails, he stalked the streets of Athens, not just talking about virtue, but embodying it, or at least his rather stark interpretation of it. Let us dwell for a moment on his clothing. It was, by all accounts, abysmal. He wore the same threadbare cloak every day, often torn and tattered, seemingly held together by stubbornness and perhaps one last thread of wool clinging to its comrades for dear life. He didn't merely tolerate poverty, he wore it like a badge. He made himself a living critique of excess, a walking middle finger to vanity. One suspects that, had you offered Antisthenes a silk tunic, he'd have used it to mop a floor, after a suitable rant about the corruption of bodily luxury. But here's the truly maddening part, and what drove his critics up the nearest Ionic column. He was happy. Not the giddy, champagne-popping kind of happy, not the "I just bought a second chariot" happy, but a deeply content, hard-earned happiness, a peace forged in the fires of restraint and honed by philosophical discipline. You see, he had freed himself from the tyranny of desire, and in doing so, he had rendered himself, if not immune, then at least impressively indifferent to life's slings and arrows. "Do you know what makes a man rich?" he once asked, rhetorically, of course, because the answer was already forming on his lips. "Not having many possessions, but having few needs." This was no gimmick. This was his gospel. Antisthenes had discovered that the quickest route to wealth wasn't acquisition, but subtraction. It's the kind of idea that sounds quaint, until you remember that he didn't just say it, he lived it. While others chased after gold and glory, Antisthenes was chasing clarity, and he found it not in the echo of applause, but in the echo of his own thoughts. He claimed to have mastered the art of talking to himself, not out of madness, but out of self-reliance. There's something beautifully ironic about a man who renounced society, and in doing so became one of its sharpest mirrors. And yet, for all his Spartan severity, Antisthenes wasn't merely a grump in a cape. He had a deeply ethical mission, to strip away illusion and help others live better. He believed people were enslaved not by chains or tyrants, but by opinion, by the need to please, to impress, to belong. He wanted to crack open the cage of public approval and let the soul, blinking and uncertain, step into the daylight. Nowhere is this clearer than in his approach to logos, reasoned speech. He wasn't a sophist. In fact, he loathed the sophists, those velvet-tongued wordsmiths who charged handsome fees to teach young Athenians how to win arguments. To Antisthenes, that was like training someone to juggle knives without teaching them not to stab people. He believed that words should reveal truth, not obscure it. Language, he said, must be used with precision, not to manipulate, but to illuminate. There's a delicious story that captures his prickliness on this matter. When Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped, Antisthenes reportedly took a plucked chicken, held it aloft in Plato's academy, and cried, "Behold, a man!" One can only imagine the silence that followed, or perhaps riotous laughter, or perhaps Plato muttering, "Touché," and pouring himself a large cup of wine. This plucked chicken anecdote, delightful as it is, tells us a great deal about Antisthenes' view of philosophy. It wasn't a game. It wasn't about clever definitions or rhetorical flourishes. It was about truth, lived truth. And if you couldn't use your lofty ideas to actually live better, what good were they? He was a man of unrelenting ethical seriousness, and that seriousness often took the form of satire. He had a gift for deflation, for poking holes in pomp and circumstance, but he did it not as a jester, but as a surgeon. His aim was not mockery, but healing through honesty, even if it stung. And yet, even Antisthenes, he of the ascetic bent and sour expression, had relationships, human ones. He was not entirely a hermit. One of his most famous disciples was a man named Diogenes, who would go on to become even more scandalously unorthodox than his teacher. But let us not rush to Diogenes quite yet. What's important here is that Antisthenes taught. He passed on his ideas. He cared in his own spiky way about helping others live with integrity. We often think of philosophers as disembodied minds, floating like helium balloons above the fray of real life. Antisthenes was not that. He was planted firmly on the ground, barefoot, slightly smelly perhaps, and absolutely unyielding in his conviction that philosophy should make us better, not just cleverer. And perhaps that is his greatest legacy, the idea that a good life requires not more stuff, but more soul. Not wealth, but wisdom. Not approval, but alignment with one's own values. However inconvenient, uncomfortable, or contrary they may be to the world around you. In a world teetering always on the edge of distraction and indulgence, Antisthenes remains, still, like a stone in the shoe of civilization. Unpleasant, perhaps, inconvenient, but impossible to ignore. Part 5. If you ever find yourself tempted by a golden trinket, a flattering whisper, or the seductive call of a reclining couch, spare a thought for Antisthenes, Athens' original killjoy, truth-teller, and aesthetic terrorist. We've spoken of his scorn for luxury, his deep suspicion of language's slipperiness, his moral puritanism, and his furious belief that virtue, true, robust, flint-edged virtue, was not a philosophical hobby, but a full-time occupation. But if we peer just a little further into the stubbled contours of his mind, we find another current, pulsing beneath all that sternness, a strange, unvarnished kind of joy. Yes, joy. That may sound like a contradiction in terms, given this is the man who thought soft pillows made cowards of us all. But Antisthenes' joy was of a particular breed, not the bubbly kind that pops like Prosecco on a summer terrace, but the hard-won joy of someone who has stripped life of its costumes and is left finally with something honest. Antisthenes believed that freedom was not granted by society, nor won in battle, nor purchased with coin. Freedom for him began in the mind. To be free was to need nothing. And to need nothing, one had to train not the body, not the purse, not even the reputation, but the soul. He once declared that he would rather go mad than feel pleasure. Most of us, if we're honest, might rather choose the pleasure. Madness, after all, doesn't come with hors d'oeuvres. But for Antisthenes, pleasure was treacherous. It dulled the instincts, bribed the reason, shackled the will. Pleasure, he thought, was the cosmetic surgeon of the soul, a quick fix for deeper wounds, leaving everything vaguely worse. And so, he taught that the good life was not found in comfort, but in endurance, that the highest pleasure came not from fulfilling desire, but from learning not to have it in the first place. A bit like realizing the cake you've been eyeing through the bakery window doesn't have power over you anymore. You walk past. You do not buy. And oddly, this small act feels more liberating than if you had devoured the whole gâteau and the box it came in. Now, lest we imagine Antisthenes merely as a cranky old goat haranguing passers-by from a doorstep, it's worth noting that his ideas found root. They seeded a philosophical movement. His greatest student, Diogenes of Sinope, took the torch from his master and promptly hurled it into the sun, metaphorically speaking. Living in a barrel, mocking Alexander the Great, and masturbating in public, which, for the record, Antisthenes probably wouldn't have endorsed, but he certainly laid the groundwork for such blistering independence. In Antisthenes' school, if you can call it that, for it lacked most of the trappings of schools, like buildings, fees, or basic hospitality, the subject was always the same: how to become invincible to fortune. Not by building walls or storing grain or kissing the hems of powerful men, but by needing nothing from them. He is richest, he said, who is content with the least. It sounds like something you'd find on a fridge magnet today and promptly ignore, but he meant it. He lived it, and what's more, he dared others to try. A rare quality in any age is consistency. In ours, it is nearly extinct. We have become a species that tweets virtues it does not practice and buys books it will never read. Antisthenes, bless him, was agonizingly consistent. His life and thought were joined at the hip. To be in his company must have been both invigorating and deeply uncomfortable. He saw through excuses. He had no patience for flattery. He asked hard questions and waited silently and raggedly for an answer. And still, there's a strange generosity to him. He didn't live simply to punish himself. He wasn't a self-hater. He wasn't flagellating under the Athenian sun for kicks. He lived simply because he believed others could be free if they tried, that they were chained by illusion, and illusion, unlike iron, can be cast off. If only someone would tell you where the lock was. Antisthenes pointed to it. The lock, he said, is opinion. What others think of you. What you think of them thinking of you. The shame, the pride, the endless self-measurement by another's yardstick. Break that, and the rest follows. Of course, most of us would rather repaint the cage than leave it. Antisthenes was not most of us. It is tempting to compare him to prophets. He had that flavor of moral thunder. But he lacked the softness of parables. He didn't hold your hand. He smacked the illusion out of it. He didn't offer comfort. He offered clarity. And clarity, as anyone who's stared at themselves too long in a bathroom mirror can attest, is not always pleasant. What are we left with then? A man in tatters who made arguments tighter than Plato's robes. A disciple of Socrates who learned not just to think, but to live in permanent confrontation with the world's nonsense. A provocateur who believed truth, like an olive, required pressure to yield its essence. And most remarkably, a man who declared war not on other men, but on need itself. Whether we follow him or not is another matter. Few of us will renounce comfort. Fewer still will find themselves arguing definitions of virtue in threadbare cloaks on a cold stone bench. But perhaps we can carry a sliver of Antisthenes with us the next time we are tempted to believe the new is better, that fame is important, or that our worth is found in anyone else's gaze. He would tell us it's all illusion. Strip it away, stand there, think, endure. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find you don't need half as much as you thought. Maybe what you are is enough. That, in the end, was Antisthenes' wager. And 2,000 years later, it still hasn't been called.